Hey everyone, have you ever stopped to think about just how crazy complex our minds are? Like we do the simplest things every day without even realizing the mental gymnastics going on behind the scenes?
It really is mind-boggling.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Yeah.
We're cracking open Steven Pinker's book, How the Mind Works, to explore the mysteries of the human brain.
It's a fascinating look at how evolution has shaped our minds into these incredible organs of computation.
Organs of computation, that sounds intense.
It is. But it also makes sense when you start to think about the sheer amount of processing power our brains handle every second.
Okay, so give me an example. What's something we do that seems simple but is actually super complex?
Let's take something as seemingly mundane as a 4-year-old putting a toy away on a shelf.
Seems pretty straightforward.
Right. But think about everything going on in that child's brain. They're processing visual information, coordinating their movements, understanding spatial relationships.
Yeah, when you break it down like that.
It's a symphony of computations. And it's something we still can't fully replicate in robots.
Well, hold on. We can send rockets to space, but we can't build a robot that can put away toys like a 4-year-old.
It highlights just how incredibly complex and sophisticated the human mind really is. What we perceive as a single action is actually a cascade of intricate calculations happening in the brain.
Okay, so my mind is officially blown. But this brings up a bigger question. What exactly is the mind? Is it just our brain in action?
That's a great question, and one that Pinker explores in detail. He argues that the mind is essentially what the brain does. Thinking itself is a form of computation, like a biological computer constantly processing information.
So our brains are like little computers running all the time.
You could say that. Your brain is constantly taking in data from your senses, processing it using its own internal language and symbols, and then producing outputs, thoughts, emotions, actions. Everything we experience is the result of this continuous computation.
Okay, that makes sense for concrete things like seeing and moving. But what about more abstract stuff like beliefs and desires? Like, I believe pizza is the best food ever. Is that a computation too?
Even abstract concepts like beliefs and desires are ultimately represented by physical states in your brain.
You mean like actual physical changes?
Think of it as patterns of neural activity, like a code that your brain uses to represent information. Your love for pizza, your belief in a certain political ideology, all of that is encoded in the physical structure and activity of your brain.
Whoa, so my love for pizza is literally wired into my brain. That's wild. But how does the brain manage all these different tasks without getting overloaded? We're not constantly thinking about breathing and digesting and composing a symphony all at once.
Right, and that's where Pinker's idea of mental modules comes in.
Mental modules.
He suggests that our minds are organized into these specialized modules, like mental organs, each designed to handle a specific task.
So it's like a team of experts, each with their own area of expertise.
Exactly. Think of it like a well-oiled machine with different parts working together seamlessly.
Okay, I like that analogy. So
Yeah.
give me an example. How does this mental module thing work in real life?
Take vision, for example. Right now, you're seeing the world in 3D, but your eyes are only capturing flat 2D images.
True.
It's your visual perception module that takes those 2D images and constructs that sense of depth and space.
It's true. I never really think about how my brain is building my reality.
It's happening all the time behind the scenes. And this modular approach allows our brains to be incredibly efficient and adaptable.
But if our visual perception module is so good at its job, why do optical illusions fool us sometimes?
That's a great question, and it highlights that even though our mental modules are incredibly sophisticated, they can still be tricked. Optical illusions exploit certain quirks in how our visual system processes information, leading to these fascinating perceptual
So it's
errors.
like hacking our brain's code.
In a way, yes, and this idea that our brains can be fooled by cleverly designed stimuli has huge implications, not just for understanding perception, but also for fields like advertising, marketing, and even art.
That makes you wonder what else our brains are getting wrong without us even realizing it.
It's a humbling thought, but it also underscores the power of the scientific method to reveal the hidden workings of our minds. And speaking of revealing, let's talk about how these mental modules got so good at their jobs in the first place. Where does evolution fit into all of this?
Okay, so how did our brains become these supercomputers capable of running all these complex modules?
Well, that's where evolution comes in. These mental modules weren't designed overnight. They were honed by millions of years of natural selection, favoring those individuals who had brains that were better at solving problems and surviving in their environment.
So basically, our minds are a collection of ancient survival tools that have been passed down through generations.
You could think of it that way. The basic design principles of our minds were shaped by the challenges our ancestors faced. Things like finding food, avoiding predators, and navigating complex social relationships.
So does that mean we're basically just cavemen in disguise, walking around with Stone Age brains?
Not quite. It's not about being stuck in the past. It's about understanding that our mental machinery was built to solve problems that were relevant for survival and reproduction back then.
Okay, I see the distinction. But if evolution plays such a big role, does that mean our genes determine everything about us? What about our own unique experiences and choices? Where does learning fit in?
That's a crucial question and one that's often debated. Pinker pushes back against the idea that our minds are simply blank slates at birth, waiting to be written on by experience. He argues that our genes play a significant role in shaping our mental structures, predisposing us to certain ways of thinking and behaving.
So nature versus nurture.
It's not either, it's both. Our genes provide the blueprint, but our experiences and environment shape how that blueprint unfolds. It's a complex interplay between nature and nurture.
I've always wondered about that. So are we talking about specific genes for specific talents? Like, is there a gene for being good at math or music?
It's generally more nuanced than that. Pinker uses the example of the controversial violence gene to illustrate this point. While there might be genes that influence aggression, they don't act in isolation.
Yeah, I've heard about that. But isn't blaming a single gene for something as complex as violence a bit simplistic?
Absolutely. It's a gross oversimplification, and it highlighted the dangers of misinterpreting genetic influences. Genes don't work in isolation. They interact with each other and with our environment, our experiences, shaping who we become. It's this intricate dance between nature and nurture that makes each of us unique.
Okay, so it's more like a complex recipe than a simple on-off switch. But this brings up another question. How does all this information get stored in our brains? Like, do we have mental snapshots of everything we've ever seen or learned?
That's where the fascinating world of mental representations comes in. Pinker argues that our minds use multiple formats for representing information. Visual forms, abstract words, grammatical structures, even a theoretical mentalese, a language of thought.
Hold on, mentalese. Are you saying there's a whole other language happening in our heads that we're not even aware of?
It's a concept capturing how thoughts are structured independently of any spoken language. Think about reading a book.
Okay.
You might forget the exact words, but the meaning sticks.
Yeah, I get the gist even if I don't remember the specific wording.
Exactly. So we're not just storing mental photographs or recordings. Our brains are more efficient than that.
That's true. So we're not just storing mental photographs. Our brains are more efficient than that.
Right. Mental representations are more flexible. Think about learning a new typeface.
Okay.
You don't have to relearn what letters mean just because they look a bit different.
Wow, that's a great point. It's like my knowledge of letters is tied to this abstract concept, not just to their visual form.
That's a key feature of human intelligence. The ability to generalize knowledge, learn new things, and access information efficiently, all thanks to these sophisticated mental representations.
This whole concept of mental representations is blowing my mind. It's like there's this whole hidden level of computation happening behind the scenes. Speaking of computation, what about those neural networks everyone's talking about? Are those like artificial brains?
They're computer models inspired by the brain structure. Imagine interconnected nodes like simplified neurons, processing and transmitting information.
So they learn like our brains do.
Exactly. You feed them data and they learn to recognize patterns, make predictions, even perform complex tasks. They're a powerful tool for understanding how our brains might work, and they're also leading to incredible advancements in artificial intelligence.
That's both amazing and slightly terrifying. But if they're based on our brains, do they have similar limitations? What happens if there's an error?
One remarkable thing about neural networks is their graceful degradation. Unlike a traditional computer that might crash with a single error, neural networks can handle some damage or noise and still function.
So they're robust and adaptable, just like our brains. That's reassuring. But this brings up a big question. If our brains are always generating new thoughts and ideas, how do we manage all that information? The possibilities seem endless.
You've hit upon a core challenge, the combinatorial explosion of thought. Even with billions of neurons, the sheer number of potential thought combinations is astronomical, quickly exceeding our brain's capacity.
Whoa, so our brains have a storage limit.
It's not so much about storage space as it is about the overwhelming number of potential combinations. Pinker uses this brilliant analogy of a chessboard to illustrate this.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Imagine placing 1 grain of wheat on the first square, 2 on the second, doubling each time. By the 64th square, you'd have more wheat than ever harvested in history.
That escalated quickly. Okay, I see how the possibilities get out of control fast. So how does our brain manage this combinatorial explosion? Do we just filter out the irrelevant stuff?
Pinker suggests our minds use a combination of what's called fuzzy logic and rule-based systems to navigate this vast landscape of thoughts.
Wait, fuzzy logic. Does that mean our brains are a bit, well, fuzzy?
Not fuzzy as in unclear, but fuzzy as in dealing with degrees of truth.
Okay.
You see, in real life, things aren't always black and white. We use fuzzy logic to navigate shades of gray, to make decisions when the information is incomplete or ambiguous.
So like when we try to define what makes a vegetable, there's no single perfect answer.
Exactly. A tomato is technically a fruit, but we often categorize it as a vegetable. Our minds can handle these fuzzy categories.
But we also rely on clear-cut rules and logic, right?
Absolutely. We switch between fuzzy and rule-based thinking depending on the situation. This flexibility is key to handling the complexity of the world.
So it's like having different mental tools for different jobs.
Precisely. And this ability to seamlessly switch between different modes of thinking is one of the things that makes the human mind so incredibly adaptable. It's really quite remarkable.
It's amazing how our brains can juggle all of this. But this brings up what I think is the biggest mystery of all: consciousness. If we're just biological computers, what about that subjective experience, the feeling of what it's like to be us? Can science even explain that? That's the big one, isn't it? Like, how do we go from neurons firing to actually feeling something?
It's what some philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. Even with everything we know about the brain, Pinker admits that explaining subjective experience is still a huge challenge. Like, we can map the brain activity when you see the color blue, but what makes it feel like blue to you? That's the mystery.
So is science just giving up then? Are we stuck not knowing how consciousness works?
No, not at all. While that subjective feeling is still a puzzle, science is making progress on the mechanisms of consciousness. Think of it like this. We may not fully grasp what it's like to be a bat, but we can study how their brains use echolocation to navigate. It's about understanding the how and the why.
I see. So we're chipping away at the problem.
Exactly. We're getting closer all the time.
This makes me wonder, though, how did something as complex as consciousness even evolve in the first place?
It's a question that's baffled scientists and philosophers for centuries. Pinker uses the evolution of the eye as a great analogy.
What do you mean?
Well, some people argue that something as intricate as the eye couldn't have evolved gradually. It seems like it needs all the parts to work at all.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine how it could have developed piece by piece.
Right. But that's not how evolution works. Pinker talks about these computer simulations done by Dan Nilsson and Suzanne Pelger.
Okay.
They started with a simple light-sensitive patch and let it evolve in a virtual environment where better vision meant better survival.
So they basically simulated evolution.
Exactly. And guess what happened?
Did it actually develop into a real eye?
Over time, through random mutations and selection pressure, that simple patch transformed into a complex eye, complete with a lens, a retina, all the essential parts.
No way.
It's incredible. It's like evolution ran its own design experiment and came up with the eye.
That's mind-blowing. So no grand designer needed, just the power of natural selection tinkering away for millions of years.
Exactly. It's a testament to the incredible power of evolution to create complexity from simplicity. And the same goes for our minds. Those specialized mental modules didn't just appear overnight.
Right.
They evolved gradually, each new feature offering some advantage for survival or reproduction.
It's like we're walking around with ancient software that's been constantly updated over eons.
That's a great way to put it.
But if it's all about these pre-programmed modules, where does learning come in? Isn't our ability to learn what makes us human?
Learning is definitely crucial, but even our capacity for learning is shaped by evolution. Pinker highlights a fascinating study by Geoffrey Hinton and Stephen Nowlin.
Okay.
They used neural networks to model how learning and evolution might interact.
Interesting. So what did they find? Did the networks learn on their own?
Well, they gave these networks a complex task to learn. Some started with no prior knowledge, while others had a few pre-wired connections representing innate knowledge.
Like a head start.
Exactly, and those with some built-in knowledge learned much faster and more efficiently.
So it's like having a cheat sheet for the test.
You could say that. And what's even more interesting is that over time, the simulation favored the networks with more innate connections.
So learning itself led to more innateness.
Precisely. It's this remarkable feedback loop where learning can actually drive the evolution of innate traits.
That's a pretty wild concept. So even our ability to learn is tied to our evolutionary history. It's not just about being blank slates. We come preloaded with some pretty impressive software.
Exactly. And this has implications for how we think about learning and education. It's not just about filling empty vessels, it's about understanding how our brains are wired to learn and tailoring our teaching methods accordingly.
That makes sense. This whole discussion about evolution makes me wonder about animal intelligence. We often put humans at the top of the intelligence ladder.
Right.
But is that really accurate?
It's a very human-centric way of looking at things. Pinker argues that ranking animal intelligence on a single scale is misleading because each species has a brain that's specialized for its way of life, not for being smarter in some general human sense.
It's more about being the best at what you do, not about being the smartest overall.
Exactly. Think about ants, for example.
Ants.
Yeah. They might seem simple, but they have incredible navigational abilities. Using a method called path integration, they can travel far from their nest and still find their way back without any external landmarks.
It's like they have built-in GPS.
Pretty much. And that's just one example. Every animal, from bees doing their intricate dances to bats navigating with echolocation, has evolved cognitive abilities that are perfectly suited for its particular niche.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about us? What makes the human brain so unique? How do we get so different?
Our story starts millions of years ago with our primate ancestors. Pinker traces the key changes that set us on a different path.
I'm guessing walking upright was a big one.
Absolutely. That freed our hands for tool use and manipulation, which in turn led to hunting and the need for even more sophisticated cognitive abilities. It was a pivotal evolutionary step.
So standing up was good for our brains.
It certainly was. But it wasn't just about getting bigger brains. The human brain developed specialized modules and interconnected circuits that allowed for abstract thinking language and complex social interactions.
It's like our brains became more specialized and more interconnected at the same time.
Exactly. It was this incredible combination that really set us apart.
So we stand up, our hands are free, we start using tools, our brains get bigger and more complex. It's like a chain reaction.
A chain reaction that ultimately led to the emergence of human intelligence as we know it.
This brings up a question, though. If our brains are so shaped by our past, how much control do we really have over our behavior? Are we just running on autopilot, driven by ancient instincts?
Pinker argues that many seemingly flexible human behaviors are actually rooted in instincts that were honed by natural selection. He quotes William James, who said, "Not one man in a billion when taking his dinner ever thinks of utility. He eats because the food tastes good and makes him want more."
That's so true. We don't analyze every action, we just do what feels right.
Exactly. And those feelings, those intuitions are often rooted in instincts that evolved to promote survival and reproduction. It's like we have a set of pre-programmed responses that guide our actions without us even realizing it.
So how much of our behavior is actually conscious choice versus just following these ancient programs? It's a bit unsettling to think about.
It is. But Pinker argues that understanding these evolutionary influences can actually give us more control over our behavior. If we know how our minds are wired, we can start to make more conscious and informed decisions.
I like that. Knowledge is power.
Yeah.
So if we're so driven by instinct, can you give me some specific examples of how this plays out in our everyday lives?
Sure. Let's start with vision. We talked about how our brains construct a 3D world from 2D images.
Right.
But Pinker describes our vision as a description building machine, meaning it doesn't just passively record what it sees.
The description building machine. What does that even mean?
Well, imagine you're looking at a book,
Oh.
a rectangular book from different angles. The image on your retina changes, but you still perceive it as a rectangle.
Right.
Your brain is actively computing a description of the object, not just recording the retinal image.
So it's like my brain is filling in the gaps, using its knowledge of the world to create a stable perception.
Exactly. It's using assumptions like objects tend to keep their shape to build a consistent model of the world.
That's amazing. And this whole process relies heavily on depth perception, right? Like, how do our brains figure out how far away things are? It still seems like magic to me.
It is pretty magical. Each eye sees the world from a slightly different angle, and our brains use that tiny difference to calculate distance.
Okay.
It's called stereo vision. But it's not always perfect. Pinker talks about how our brains rely on assumptions to solve the complexities of depth perception.
Assumptions like what?
For example, we assume that objects are opaque, meaning one can't be seen through another. This helps us make sense of overlapping images, but it can also lead to illusions when those assumptions are violated.
So our brains can be tricked by their own shortcuts.
In a way, yes, those shortcuts or assumptions are usually helpful, allowing us to process visual information quickly and efficiently. But they're also a reminder that our perception of the world isn't always accurate. Our brains are actively constructing reality, not just mirroring it.
Okay, so we've got this description building and depth perception. But what about those pictures we see in our minds? Are they like real photographs or something else entirely?
That's a question that has sparked endless debates. Pinker presents evidence supporting both sides. Some studies suggest our mental images are picture-like. We can rotate them, zoom in, even experience illusions with them.
So they are like real pictures in our heads.
But other evidence suggests they're more abstract, more like descriptions. We can easily reinterpret ambiguous figures like the duck-rabbit illusion using mental imagery.
Right, so it's like our brains can switch between different interpretations.
Exactly. This dynamic nature suggests that mental images aren't just static photographs, but representations that our brains are actively constructing and modifying.
That's so cool. It makes me wonder about babies, though. Do they come into the world with these mental image skills, or does it develop later?
That's a great question, and it leads us to the fascinating world of infant cognition. Pinker challenges this old view of babies as being in a state of blooming, buzzing confusion.
Oh yeah, I've heard that.
Turns out they're far more cognitively sophisticated than we once thought.
Really? But they can't even talk or walk. How do we know what's going on in those tiny brains?
Researchers have developed clever methods to study infant cognition, observing things like gaze patterns, sucking reflexes, and reactions to unexpected events. And what they've found is that even very young babies have a basic understanding of the physical world.
So like they know that objects exist even when they can't see them?
Exactly. Pinker calls it intuitive physics. Studies show that infants as young as 3 to 4 months old grasped concepts like continuity, meaning objects don't just vanish and reappear randomly.
So peekaboo is more profound than we realize.
Right. It's actually tapping into their developing understanding of object permanence.
What other physics concepts do babies understand?
They understand cohesion, meaning that objects are solid and don't just fall apart. And they understand contact, that objects need to touch to interact.
It's like they have a basic physics engine running in their brains from day one.
Exactly. These findings suggest that we come into the world pre-wired with knowledge that helps us make sense of our surroundings.
So we're not just blank slates.
Not at all. We come preloaded with some pretty impressive software.
Babies are way cooler than I thought. So they understand basic physics, but what about reasoning? Can they think logically at that age?
That's another area where research has uncovered some surprising infant capabilities. Pinker talks about how babies go beyond simple similarity-based reasoning.
What do you mean by that?
Think about how we categorize things. We don't just group objects by looks. We use rules and concepts.
So like knowing that dolphins and sharks look similar, but one's a mammal and the other's a fish.
Exactly. We're using deeper knowledge to categorize them. Pinker uses the example of chimps and gorillas.
Okay.
Both primates visually quite similar, but we distinguish them based on their diet. Chimps are omnivores, gorillas are herbivores.
So we're using abstract knowledge to categorize not just appearance. And babies can do this too.
Studies show that babies as young as 9 months old can make similar distinctions, suggesting they're already using rule-based reasoning. It's not just about what things look like, they're starting to think about deeper relationships.
That's incredible. Tiny philosophers in diapers.
Right. But if babies have this logical capacity, why do we adults make so many logical errors? We don't always make the most rational decisions.
Tell me about it. I fall for cognitive biases all the time.
Well, Pinker addresses this apparent paradox. He argues that while we do have logical capacity, our mental logic isn't perfect, like formal logic, the kind you learn in philosophy class.
Yeah.
Our mental logic is influenced by context, by our assumptions, and by the limitations of our working memory.
So it's like our brains are trying to be efficient, but those shortcuts sometimes lead us astray.
Think of it as a trade-off between speed and accuracy. Our mental logic evolved to solve real-world problems quickly, not to ace logic puzzles. Pinker uses something called the Wason selection task as an example.
What's that?
It's a classic logic problem where you have to figure out which cards to turn over to test a rule.
Okay.
People often struggle with the abstract version, but their performance improves dramatically when the same logic is presented in a familiar, real-world context.
So our brains are better at logic when it applies to everyday situations, not abstract problems.
Exactly. And this makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Our brains evolved to solve the kinds of problems our ancestors faced, navigating social situations, finding food, avoiding danger. Abstract logic wasn't as crucial for survival.
Right. What about probability then? We always hear that humans are terrible at it and that we fall for all sorts of biases. Is that really true?
Pinker actually challenges that notion. He argues that our intuitions about probability are often quite accurate, especially in real-world situations.
Okay.
But what about things like the gambler's fallacy? That idea that a coin is due for tails after a streak of heads?
Yeah, I've definitely fallen for that one.
Pinker points out that the gambler's fallacy is only a fallacy in artificial contexts like casinos, where randomness is carefully controlled.
Right.
But in real life, events are often dependent. If a basketball player makes several shots in a row, it's actually reasonable to assume they're hot and more likely to make the next one.
So our probability judgments are shaped by our experience of a world where things aren't always perfectly random.
Exactly. And in those contexts, our intuitions can be quite effective. The problem arises when we apply them to situations where randomness is artificially maintained.
So we're not inherently bad at probability. We just need to be mindful of the context. That's good to know. But what about those big abstract concepts like time, relationships, or emotions? How do our brains even begin to grasp those?
It's a fascinating question. Our brains use these amazing metaphorical frameworks to understand abstract concepts. Pinker argues that we often think in terms of space, force, and motion, even when dealing with ideas that have no physical form.
Okay, so give me an example. How do we use metaphors to understand something abstract like time?
We talk about time as if it were a physical path that we're moving along.
Like moving forward into the future or looking back on the past.
Exactly. Or we use metaphors of force like time pressure or grasping an idea. These metaphors are so ingrained in our language and thought that we often don't even realize we're using them.
It's like they're hidden in plain sight.
Precisely. And Pinker argues that these metaphors aren't just linguistic flourishes. They reflect deep cognitive structures that shape how we understand and reason about the world.
So our brains are basically using these concrete analogies to grapple with abstract concepts.
It's a way of making the abstract more manageable, more relatable to our embodied experience.
That's pretty cool. It makes me wonder what other metaphorical frameworks we're using without even realizing it.
It's a question worth pondering, but before we go too far down that rabbit hole, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier. Emotions.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Where do they fit into this whole picture of the computational mind? Are they just irrational glitches in our otherwise logical brains?
Pinker argues that emotions are actually sophisticated adaptations, just like those mental modules we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
They serve specific functions, provide us with valuable information, and guide our behavior in ways that have been beneficial for survival and reproduction.
Okay, but how can emotions be adaptive? Sometimes they seem to lead us to make really terrible decisions.
Well, it's important to remember that emotions evolve to promote survival and reproduction, not necessarily happiness or well-being in the modern sense. Think about it. Our ancestors lived in a world full of danger and uncertainty.
Yeah, definitely not a walk in the park.
Emotions like fear and anger would have been crucial for survival. They allowed our ancestors to react quickly to threats.
It's like a built-in alarm system.
Exactly. And disgust, for example, is our body's way of protecting us from things that could harm us, like rotten food or bodily fluid.
Like an internal, ew, get that away from me response.
Exactly. And while those disgust responses might sometimes be overblown in our modern sanitized world, they generally served our ancestors well. Emotions are part of our evolved toolkit for navigating the world.
This is really making me rethink how I view emotions. Instead of trying to suppress them, maybe we should be trying to understand what they're telling us. What about happiness, though? What's its evolutionary purpose? Are we programmed to be happy?
That's a great question. Pinker discusses this idea of the hedonic treadmill.
The hedonic treadmill.
It suggests that our happiness levels tend to return to a baseline, even after major life events.
Oh, like if you win the lottery, you're super happy at first, but eventually you just go back to your normal level of happiness.
Exactly. It might seem depressing, but it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. If we were constantly blissed out, we wouldn't be motivated to do anything.
Right. We need that drive to keep us moving forward.
The hedonic treadmill keeps us striving, seeking out new challenges and rewards that might enhance our fitness.
It's like we're wired for progress. Always looking for the next thing that will push us further.
Precisely. And this brings us to another fascinating aspect of human behavior: self-control. Why is it so hard to resist those tempting donuts, even when we know they're not good for us in the long run?
Oh, don't even get me started on donuts. My willpower crumbles every time.
Pinker frames self-control as a battle between our present self and our future self. We have to weigh the immediate gratification of a tempting reward against the potential long-term benefits of delaying gratification.
It's like my present self wants the donut, but my future self wants to fit into my jeans.
Exactly. And this internal struggle is rooted in our evolutionary past. Our ancestors couldn't always count on the future. Sometimes grabbing the immediate reward was the best strategy for survival.
So, like, back then, if you found a delicious pile of ripe berries, you wouldn't want to save them for later. You'd want to eat them before someone else did or before they went bad.
Precisely. And those instincts still linger in our brains, even though most of us now live in a world of relative abundance.
So we're fighting against millions of years of evolution every time we try to resist temptation. No wonder it's so hard. But if we're so driven by immediate gratification, how do we ever manage to save for retirement or stay on a diet or achieve any long-term goals?
That's where our capacity for abstract thought and planning comes in. We can use our understanding of the future to override those immediate impulses. Pinker suggests that understanding the evolutionary logic behind our temptations can actually help us develop better strategies for resisting them.
So like tricking our brains into thinking that future reward is more immediate.
Exactly. Finding ways to make those future rewards feel more tangible and more real can help us stay on track. It's like we're negotiating with our own evolutionary programming.
That's pretty clever. This makes me think about another interesting aspect of human behavior: altruism.
Yeah.
Why do we help others even when it doesn't seem to directly benefit us?
Pinker delves into this by exploring different types of altruism, including kin selection and reciprocal altruism.
Kin selection.
It's about helping relatives, which makes evolutionary sense because they share our genes.
So helping them is like indirectly helping ourselves.
Exactly. By increasing their chances of survival and reproduction, we're indirectly promoting the survival of our own genes. But it doesn't mean that those feelings of love and concern for family are insincere. The emotions are real, it's just that they evolved because they ultimately served the interests of our genes.
So biology and emotion working hand in hand. What about reciprocal altruism, though? What's the logic behind helping those who aren't related to us?
Reciprocal altruism is about helping others with the expectation of being helped in return.
So like you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours.
Exactly. It's a strategy that can foster cooperation and trust within a group.
Like helping a friend move knowing they'll help you out when you need it.
Precisely. And this kind of cooperation can be incredibly beneficial for both individuals and the group as a whole. Pinker talks about how reciprocal altruism can promote social cohesion and even contribute to the evolution of complex societies.
It's amazing how these seemingly selfless acts can have deep evolutionary roots. But if it's all about expecting something in return, can we really call it altruism?
That's a question that philosophers have been debating for centuries. But Pinker's point is that the emotions involved, like gratitude and the desire to reciprocate kindness, are genuine. They likely evolved because they ultimately facilitated cooperation and mutual benefit, leading to greater success for the group as a whole.
So we're wired for both selfishness and cooperation. It's like we're constantly balancing these competing drives. It makes you wonder what other seemingly human traits have a hidden evolutionary story.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, what about the drive for status and prestige? Is our desire to be admired an evolutionary thing too?
Pinker believes so. He argues that our desire for status and prestige can be traced back to our evolutionary past.
How so?
Well, status often signals things like good genes, access to resources, and strong social alliances, all things that would have been beneficial for survival and reproduction.
So being popular could have actually boosted your chances of passing on your genes. No wonder we care so much about what others think.
Right, it's not just about vanity, it's about survival. And this drive for status can manifest in all sorts of ways. From the clothes we wear, to the cars we drive, to the careers we pursue, we're constantly trying to signal our worth.
It's like we're all playing this elaborate status game without even realizing it.
Pinker uses this concept called conspicuous consumption to illustrate this point. It's the idea that people often spend money on extravagant things, not because those things are inherently useful,
Okay.
but because they signal wealth and status.
So like buying a designer handbag that costs a fortune, even though a regular bag would work just as well.
Exactly. It's a way of showing off your resources and signaling your position in the social hierarchy. And this drive for status can be observed across cultures and throughout history. It's a deeply ingrained part of human nature.
It's fascinating how these seemingly superficial behaviors can have such deep evolutionary roots.
Hmm.
But how does this drive for status fit with the idea of sharing and reciprocity? Aren't those two things kind of at odds with each other?
Not necessarily. Sharing can actually enhance your status within a group, especially in environments where resources are unpredictable. Think about it if you're a hunter-gatherer and you share your surplus with others. You build up a reputation for generosity and trustworthiness.
So it's like investing in social capital.
Exactly. You're building a network of support by being generous. And this kind of reciprocal sharing would have been crucial for survival in those harsh, unpredictable environments. Pinker gives examples from foraging societies, where sharing is often driven by these strategic considerations, not just pure altruism.
So generosity is its own reward.
You could say that it builds trust and strengthens social bonds. Which brings us to the flip side of cooperation, conflict.
Right, because humans aren't always altruistic and cooperative. We also have a capacity for aggression and violence.
That's true. And Pinker doesn't shy away from this difficult topic. He argues that while warfare is not inevitable, it can be understood through the lens of evolution. Competition over resources, territory, and mates can escalate into violence and warfare.
So it's like a darker side of that drive for survival and dominance we were talking about earlier.
Precisely. And he discusses this idea called the male warrior hypothesis, which suggests that men in particular have evolved psychological adaptations for coalitionary violence. This isn't to say that women aren't capable of violence, but historically, men have been the primary participants in warfare.
And that likely stems from the different reproductive strategies of men and women. Men who can potentially father many children would be more likely to engage in risky behavior to compete for resources and status.
That's the idea. But it's crucial to remember that understanding the evolutionary roots of a behavior doesn't make it morally acceptable. While we might have evolved predispositions for violence, we also have the capacity for reason, empathy, and cooperation. We can choose to overcome our baser instincts and work towards a more peaceful world.
It's a reminder that we're not just slaves to our biology. We have the power to choose a different path. But before we wrap things up, I have one more question that's been bugging me. We've talked about so many practical behaviors that have an evolutionary basis. Things like finding food, avoiding danger, and attracting mates.
Right.
But what about things like art music and storytelling? They don't seem to have any obvious survival value. How do they fit into this whole evolutionary picture?
Pinker addresses this head-on, proposing that even seemingly frivolous activities like art, music, and storytelling can serve adaptive functions.
Really? So they're not just useless distractions?
Not necessarily. Think about it. Fictional narratives can help us prepare for social dilemmas and explore different strategies for dealing with conflict. It's like running simulations in our minds.
So reading a novel could actually make me better at dealing with real-life drama.
It's possible. And music can facilitate social bonding, evoke powerful emotions, and transmit cultural knowledge. These activities might seem frivolous on the surface, but they tap into our evolved cognitive machinery, offering benefits that might not be immediately obvious.
It's like we're wired for creativity and self-expression. It's part of what makes us human.
Exactly.
Well, this has been an absolutely incredible deep dive. I feel like my brain has expanded by at least 10%.
It's been a pleasure exploring the wonders of the human mind with you.
And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this journey through the intricate workings of our brains. We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. If you're eager to delve deeper into the mysteries of the mind, we highly recommend checking out Steven Pinker's book, How the Mind Works. It's a fascinating and thought-provoking read. And remember, the mind is the ultimate frontier. There's always more to explore. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.